Second Chances. Chapter 1: The Fall. Fate sometimes chooses the cruelest ways to reshape a man's life. Jack Thornton, 37 years old and a third-generation Marine Corps specialist, learned this brutal truth in a forgotten alley of Fallujah. The blast that should have killed him instead left him half a man, a broken warrior confined to a wheelchair with no feeling below his waist. The decorated veteran who disarmed over 60 IEDs during 4 combat tours now faced his greatest challenge: learning to live with himself. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered floorboards of Thornton's hardware as Jack maneuvered his wheelchair behind the ancient oak counter. 8 months had passed since he'd used his military settlement to purchase this fatting establishment in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a drowsy river town that time had seemingly forgotten. The place smelled of sawdust, metal shavings, and history. 3 generations of Millbrook residents had bought their tools here before the previous owner decided Florida's warm embrace was preferable to Pennsylvania's bitter winters. Jack absently rubbed the phantom pain in his useless legs while listening to the quiet rhythm of the store, the gentle hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional creak of century-old timber, and the soft footsteps of his wife, Rebecca, as she restocked the paint display. His eyes drifted to her slender figure, still youthful at 30, as she stretched to reach a high shelf. That familiar pang of guilt twisted in his gut. What kind of life had he offered this beautiful woman? Trapped in a backwater town, married to half a man, her dreams of adventure reduced to organizing hardware inventory. "Need help with those cans?" Jack called, his voice carrying the gravelly edge that 4 tours in combat zones had etched into it. Rebecca turned, her copper hair catching the light. "I've got it," she replied with that smile that never quite reached her eyes anymore, "just finishing up before closing." Their eyes met briefly before she looked away. Jack couldn't help but notice how she did that more often lately, breaking eye contact as if afraid he might see something there she wasn't ready to share. The silent distance between them had been growing steadily, like rust slowly corroding once solid metal. Later that evening, as darkness settled over Millbrook, Jack sat alone in his office above the store, the bottle of bourbon on his desk more empty than full. Through the security monitors, he watched Rebecca lock the front door. His modified Remington 700 rifle, the one item from his military days he couldn't bring himself to part with, rested in its custom cabinet on the wall. The rifle represented something he could no longer be: precise, deadly, useful. His fingers traced the Purple Heart in its case, a bitter consolation prize for the legs he'd lost. The explosion in Fallujah had taken more than his mobility, it had stolen his purpose. 20 years of Thornton men had served their country with distinction. His grandfather had earned a Silver Star in Korea, his father had led Marines through the Gulf War, and Jack had followed in their footsteps without hesitation. "Thorntons are born to serve," his father had always said. Now Jack served no one, not even himself. The nightmare still came regularly: twisted metal and concrete dust, the weight of the building crushing him, the frantic voices on the radio fading as consciousness slipped away. His rehabilitation counselor called it PTSD. Jack called it remembering. He took another swig of bourbon, savoring the burn. Through the monitor, he watched Rebecca in the stockroom, talking on her cell phone, something she did more frequently these days, always out of earshot. Her face animated in ways it rarely did with him anymore. The security system had been his first major installation after buying the store: 8 cameras covering every angle, a commercial-grade alarm system, reinforced doors. The other shopkeepers in town joked about Marine-grade security, but old habits died hard. In Fallujah, situational awareness had kept him alive. Here in peaceful Millbrook, it gave him the only thing he truly craved: control. The door buzzer interrupted his thoughts. Jack glanced at the monitor. Who would be at the back entrance at this hour? The figure on the screen was slight, hunched against the evening chill that had descended after sunset. Just a kid, maybe 15 or 16, with dark hair and haunted eyes that somehow seemed familiar. Jack pressed the intercom button. "We're closed." "Please," the voice cracked with desperation. "I just need somewhere warm for the night. I'll be gone by morning." Jack's finger hovered over the button to dismiss the kid, but something in those hollow eyes made him pause. They reminded him of something, the mirror perhaps, during those early months after the hospital. "Rebecca," he called through the store's intercom system, "there's someone at the back door." When she didn't answer, he sighed and maneuvered his wheelchair to the elevator. The ride down seemed longer than usual, giving his thoughts time to wander to places they shouldn't go, like whom Rebecca might be talking to on that phone, or why their conversations had dwindled to functional exchanges about inventory and meal schedules. The stockroom smelled of cardboard and machine oil. Jack pressed the security release, and the heavy door swung open to reveal a skinny teenager with prominent cheekbones and wary eyes. Hispanic, Jack guessed, with a fresh bruise darkening one side of his face. The boy's clothes, oversized jacket, faded jeans, hung on his frame like surrender flags. "I'm closed, kid," Jack said, but without conviction. "I just need shelter for tonight, sir." The boy's English was good but carried a soft accent. "I can sleep on the floor. I'll be gone before you open." "You running from something?" Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. Nobody that young with eyes that old wasn't running from something. The boy's silence was answer enough. "What's your name?" Jack asked, wheeling back to allow the boy to step inside. "Tyler," the kid said, after a beat of hesitation that told Jack it wasn't his real name. "Tyler Martinez." "Well, Tyler, I'm Jack Thornton. That's my wife, Rebecca." He gestured toward the front of the store where Rebecca was now watching them, her phone conversation apparently finished. "You hungry?" The boy's hollow cheeks flushed. "I'm okay." "That wasn't what I asked," Jack replied, falling easily into the direct tone he'd used with young Marines. "When did you last eat?" "Yesterday morning," the boy admitted. "Rebecca," Jack called, "can you grab some food from the break room?" He turned back to the boy. "You can warm up and eat, then we'll figure things out." "Jack," Rebecca's voice carried a warning as she approached, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Her eyes, those vibrant green eyes that had once looked at him with such adoration, now held a mixture of frustration and concern. She pulled him aside, keeping her voice low. "What are you doing? We know nothing about this kid. He could be a thief or worse." Jack studied his wife's face. "He's a hungry teenager who needs help." "He's trouble," she hissed. "We have a business to run, a reputation in this town. We can't just—" "We can," Jack cut her off, his voice taking on the edge of command he rarely used with her. "And we will." Something in his tone made her step back. Perhaps it was hearing a fragment of the man he used to be, the Marine who'd led others through war zones, who'd made life-or-death decisions without hesitation. An hour later, the three of them sat around the small table in the employee break room. The boy, who Jack was increasingly certain wasn't named Tyler, devoured a microwaved burger and chips like someone who feared the food might vanish if he didn't consume it immediately. His eyes darted between Jack and Rebecca, always alert, always assessing. "So Tyler," Jack said, deliberately emphasizing the name, "where are you from?" "Arizona," the boy answered too quickly. "Phoenix." "And what brings you to Millbrook, Pennsylvania? We're not exactly on the tourist route." The boy's eyes dropped to his food. "Looking for work, heard there were factory jobs." Jack nodded, playing along with the lie. "The textile mill closed 3 years ago. Not much work around here unless you know someone." A heavy silence fell, broken only by the hum of the ancient refrigerator. Outside, a steady rain began to patter against the windows, the sound amplifying the warmth and security of being indoors. "There's a storage room upstairs," Jack said finally. "It's got an old cot. You can stay there tonight, get cleaned up. Tomorrow we'll talk about what comes next." Relief flooded the boy's face, quickly masked by caution. "Thank you, sir." Rebecca's mouth tightened into a thin line, but she said nothing, just gathered the empty food wrappers with sharp, angry movements. Later that night, Jack lay awake in bed, listening to Rebecca's even breathing beside him. The distance between them in the queen-sized bed might as well have been an ocean. Once, they'd slept tangled together, her head on his chest, his arms around her. Now they existed in careful orbits that never quite intersected. His mind drifted to the boy sleeping in the storage room. There was a story there, one filled with the kind of pain Jack recognized all too well, the kind that changes a person from the inside out. In the darkness, Jack's hand found the smooth grip of the pistol he kept in the nightstand. Old habits, always prepared, always vigilant. Yet somehow he'd failed to protect the most important thing in his life, his marriage. How had he missed the signs? When had Rebecca's love turned to resignation, and then to something else entirely? The rain drummed against the roof, a reminder that some forces couldn't be controlled, only endured. Jack closed his eyes, knowing that sleep would bring the familiar nightmare of concrete and dust. But tonight, for the first time in months, he found himself thinking about something other than his own pain as he drifted off. He was thinking about a boy with haunted eyes and the unmistakable look of someone who'd seen things no child should ever see. Chapter 2: The Boy. The Pennsylvania summer gripped Millbrook in a stifling embrace, the humidity pressing down like a soggy wool blanket. Jack watched from his office window as heat rippled above the cracked asphalt of Main Street. The town was quiet at midday, too hot for the usual foot traffic that kept small businesses afloat. Only the occasional car disturbed the stillness, tires whispering against the baking pavement. 6 weeks had passed since the rainy night when Tyler had appeared at their door. The boy, who eventually admitted his real name was Carlos Ramirez, had proven himself invaluable around the store. He stocked shelves, unloaded deliveries, and seemed to have an uncanny memory for inventory locations. The small storage room had become his home, gradually accumulating modest possessions: second-hand clothes from the church donation box, a few dog-eared paperbacks, a baseball cap from the high school team. Jack's security monitors showed Carlos helping an elderly customer find the right size of plumbing fixture. The boy's natural charm and earnest demeanor had won over even the most suspicious of Millbrook's residents. His story, the version he finally shared after weeks of careful trust building, had left Jack with a cold fury that needed direction. Carlos had fled his hometown of Grenada, Arizona, after a local gang called the Scorpions murdered his parents. His father, a mechanic who refused to pay protection money, and his mother, a school teacher, had been killed in their small home while Carlos hid in the crawlspace beneath the floorboards. "I heard everything," he'd told Jack one night, voice barely above a whisper. Their leader, they call him Scarface, he laughed while they did it, said no one would miss another pair of immigrants. The boy had hidden in a delivery truck, eventually making his way across the country in a series of freight trains and hitchhiked rides, hopping to reach an uncle in New Jersey. But the phone number he'd memorized was disconnected, leaving him stranded and alone when he reached Pennsylvania. Jack's intercom buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. "Jack," Rebecca's voice came through the speaker. "The porter order just arrived. Carlos is helping unload it now." "Thanks," he replied, checking the time. Rebecca should have left for her book club 20 minutes ago. These Thursday afternoon meetings had become suspiciously regular over the past few months. Jack had never questioned them directly, partly from fear of what the answer might be, partly because he recognized his own role in the growing distance between them. Through the monitor, he watched her check her appearance in the small mirror behind the counter. She looked different lately, more makeup, more revealing clothes, a new perfume that seemed excessive for a small-town hardware store. She'd been happy once, he was sure of it. In those early days after his medical discharge, when they'd first moved to Millbrook, her enthusiasm about the store had seemed genuine. She'd painted the walls herself, redesigned the layout, planted flowers in the window boxes. When had that changed? Or had it all been an act, a performance by a woman who'd married a strong, capable Marine and found herself shackled to a bitter cripple instead. The bell above the store entrance jangled, and Jack watched a group of men enter, sunglasses despite the overcast day, expensive boots that had never seen real work, tense postures that screamed trouble to Jack's combat-trained eye. Three of them, spreading out among the aisles with the practiced movements of men accustomed to controlling spaces. Jack's hand instinctively moved toward the drawer where he kept his sidearm. Something about these customers set off every alarm bell in his head. He keyed the intercom again. "Rebecca, who are those men?" There was a pause, just long enough to heighten his suspicion. "Just some contractors from the new development outside town," she replied, her voice carrying a forced casualness. "They've been placing some big orders lately." Jack watched as she approached them, her body language shifting subtly, standing straighter, smiling more broadly, touching her hair. He'd seen that behavior before, in bars near military bases when local women spotted uniforms. Carlos had frozen in place by the lumber section, his face drained of color. The boy's eyes tracked the men with the focused intensity of prey watching predators, his hands gripping a shelf support so tightly his knuckles whitened. One of the men, taller than the others, with a large scar running from his temple to his jaw, approached Rebecca. He leaned casually against the counter, too close for a normal business conversation. She didn't step back. Jack's jaw clenched as he watched the interaction. They spoke too quietly for the microphones to pick up, but their body language told a story he didn't want to read. The man's hand briefly touched Rebecca's arm, lingering longer than any casual contact would warrant. She laughed at something he said, that musical laugh Jack hadn't heard directed at him in months. "Carlos," Jack spoke into the store-wide system, "come up to the office, please." The boy looked relieved at the excuse to escape, practically sprinting to the back stairs rather than passing near the visitors. When Carlos entered the office, his face was ashen. "Mr. Thornton," he began without preamble, "those men, I know them." Jack's blood ran cold. "From where?" "Not personally, but I know what they are," Carlos said, his voice dropping to a whisper despite the closed door. "They're like the men back home, the ones who killed my parents. They have the same look." Jack nodded, having reached the same conclusion. "Did you recognize any of them specifically?" Carlos hesitated, then nodded slowly. "The one with the scar, I've never seen him up close before, but I've heard descriptions. Everyone in Granada knew about Scarface." His hands were shaking now. "What are they doing here, in Millbrook?" It was a good question, one Jack had been pondering himself. These men weren't ordinary contractors. Their purchases over the past months had included unusual combinations of materials, certain chemicals, fertilizers, electronics components. Items that individually seemed innocent enough, but together raised red flags for anyone with Jack's background in explosive ordnance disposal. "I don't know yet," Jack admitted, "but I intend to find out." After the men left, Jack reviewed their purchase history. The pattern became clearer with each invoice. They were purchasing precursor materials for both drug manufacturing and explosives. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His store, his legitimate business, was being used as a supply chain for a criminal organization. But the bigger question loomed like a shadow. Was Rebecca involved? The way she'd interacted with them, the special pricing she'd offered, the items that sometimes disappeared from inventory without proper documentation. Had his wife become entangled with these people? Or worse, had she done so willingly? That evening, Jack made a call he'd been avoiding. His former teammate from the Marines, Lieutenant Colonel David Sullivan, now worked with a joint DEA-FBI task force targeting cross-border criminal enterprises. The conversation was brief, coded in the shorthand of men who'd faced death together. "Dave, I need some off-the-books insight on a situation here." "Must be serious if you're breaking your hermit vow," Sullivan replied, the humor in his voice undercut by concern. "What's going on?" Jack explained the suspicious purchases, the men who didn't fit their cover story, the possible connection to Carlos's past. He left out his suspicions about Rebecca. Some fears were too personal to voice, even to an old friend. "Sounds like you might have a distribution network for a lab operation," Sullivan said. "This area has seen an uptick in high-grade meth moving through. Task Force thinks there's a new manufacturing hub somewhere in the tri-state region." "Any known connections to Arizona, specifically a group called the Scorpions?" Sullivan's pause was telling. "That's interesting timing. We've been tracking their expansion eastward. Their leader, guy called Richard Scarface Mendez, dropped off the radar about 3 months ago. Intelligence suggested he was setting up new territory." 3 months, right around when the contractors had first appeared at Thornton's Hardware. Jack's stomach tightened into a knot. "I need a favor, Dave," he said. "Some tracking equipment, discreet, long-lasting. I want to see where these supplies are going." "Jack," Sullivan's voice turned cautious, "if you're onto something real, you need to let us handle it. Official channels." "Not yet," Jack insisted. "I need to understand the full picture first." After a long pause, Sullivan sighed. "I'll have something sent to you. Unmarked package, untraceable. But Jack, be careful. These aren't insurgents with homemade bombs. These are organized criminals with resources and reach." "I know what I'm doing," Jack replied, though he wasn't entirely convinced of that himself. 3 days later, a nondescript package arrived containing what looked like ordinary barcode labels, but were actually sophisticated GPS trackers. "Military grade," Sullivan had explained in a secure text message. "Battery lasts 30 days, signal is encrypted, they'll never detect it." With Carlos's help, Jack began marking shipments destined for Mendez's crew. The boy's nimble fingers attached the trackers to containers while performing routine inventory checks, his years working in his father's garage having taught him to be thorough and unobtrusive. The first results came within a week. A truck loaded with chemicals that was supposedly headed to a construction site in Harrisburg took a very different route. Jack tracked it to an abandoned factory outside Millbrook. Property records showed it had been purchased 6 months earlier by a shell company with a complex ownership structure. "It's a lab," Sullivan confirmed after reviewing the data Jack sent him. "Significant operation based on power usage and supply volume. They're likely producing both meth and explosives, possibly for distribution to other criminal networks." Jack stared at the laptop screen, watching the movement patterns around the facility, regular shifts of workers, delivery vehicles coming and going, security patrols. It was run with military precision, suggesting whoever was in charge had experience with tactical operations. "How are they passing inspection?" Jack wondered aloud, examining the perfect paper trail the shell companies had created. "Tax history, bank accounts, business licenses, everything looks legitimate." "They've got someone on the inside," Sullivan replied over the secure line. "Someone helping launder their operation through legitimate businesses. Someone with a clean record and good community standing." Jack felt sick as the pieces fell into place. He didn't want to voice the conclusion forming in his mind, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. Over the next 2 weeks, Jack installed additional cameras throughout the store, now recording every interaction. Carlos, given the task of observing Rebecca, reported concerning patterns, strange phone calls in the parking lot, inventory that never made it to the sales floor, private meetings in the stockroom with the scarred man. Rebecca was changing in ways that could no longer be attributed to simple marital discontent. Designer clothes that couldn't be explained by a hardware store salary. Jewelry she claimed to have found in an old box. Late nights supposedly spent with friends Jack had never met. "Mr. Thornton," Carlos's voice through the intercom interruption Jack's surveillance one evening. Can you come down to the storage room? There's something important." When Jack arrived, the boy was pale, his hands trembling as he held up his phone with security footage. "That man who came today, the leader. I'm sure now it's him." "Mendez, Scarface," Jack clarified, feeling a chill run down his spine. Carlos nodded, his voice breaking. "He has the same laugh. I remembered it when I heard him today. It's the same laugh from that night when my parents—" He couldn't finish, his body shaking with suppressed emotion. Jack moved closer, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. He recognized the reaction, the physical manifestation of trauma when the past suddenly collides with the present. Sullivan sent a complete dossier the next day. Richard Scarface Mendez, former military dishonorable discharge, suspected of dozens of murders but never convicted. His specialty was creating legitimate fronts for criminal enterprises, particularly using small businesses in rural areas where oversight was minimal. "He targets vulnerable people," Sullivan explained, "especially women who feel trapped or overlooked. He charms them, offers them excitement and easy money. Usually picks those stuck in small towns, dreaming of something bigger. Once they're in, he keeps them compliant with blackmail material." Jack said nothing, staring at the surveillance photos. Rebecca leaving an expensive restaurant with Mendez. Rebecca passing documents in a parked car. Rebecca laughing at something the murderer of Carlos's parents had said. Her expression was animated, engaged in a way it hadn't been with Jack in months. "There are bank transfers," Sullivan continued. "Several accounts tied to shell companies. She signed documents, Jack. She knew what she was getting into." That night Jack sat in his office, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. The familiar routine usually calmed him, but now his thoughts churned with betrayal and disbelief. Downstairs, he could hear Rebecca closing up for the day, humming softly to herself. Carlos was quietly organizing shelves, pretending to dust while keeping a watchful eye on everything. Jack pulled out an old photograph from his desk, their wedding day. Bright smiles, hopeful eyes, dreams of a future together. What had gone wrong? When had his wife become an accomplice to murderers? Or had she always been this person, and he'd been too blind to see it? His phone vibrated with a message from Sullivan. "Data confirmed. They're planning a major shipment next week. What's your next move?" Jack knew he needed to act. Delay meant death, not just of his reputation, but possibly his life and Carlos's as well. Criminal organizations like the Scorpions didn't leave witnesses. Once again, he felt like an EOD specialist facing a complex explosive device. Only this bomb was far more dangerous than anything he'd encountered in combat. A plan began forming in his mind, precise, cold, military in its execution. He would use what he knew best, the skills that had once made him a war hero. Skills that might now make him a vigilante or worse. But there was no choice. Some battles need to be fought, even in peacetime. And in this battle he had an ally, a boy who, like himself, had lost everything to men with scars on their faces and souls. Chapter 3: The Reckoning. When working with explosives, every calculation matters. Jack had learned this truth through years of defusing IEDs in combat zones. A single error could mean death. Now, studying diagrams and schematics in his office, he felt the familiar chill of focused concentration. This time, however, his target wasn't a roadside bomb but a drug operation that had infiltrated his life and business. "Mr. Thornton," Carlos appeared silently in the doorway, his thin frame silhouetted against the hallway light. Dark circles had formed under his eyes over the past week, his face growing more gaunt with each passing day. "The new order is ready for pickup. They'll be here in 30 minutes. Jack nodded, studying the laptop screen where GPS trackers displayed the movement patterns of previous shipments. A web of red lines converging on the abandoned factory where Mendez had established his operation. "You remember the plan." Jack kept his voice low, though he knew Rebecca was busy with customers downstairs. Carlos nodded, his face grave but determined. "I'll switch the labels when I check the order. They won't notice the difference." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Jack would plant a small amount of C4 explosive, saved from his military days, in the next chemical shipment. The charge, precisely placed and remotely detonated, would trigger a chain reaction in the lab that would destroy evidence of drug manufacturing while minimizing the risk of casualties. Sullivan had provided the technical components, a military-grade remote detonator shielded from interference. "Latest tech," he'd explained. "We'll work through concrete walls if necessary." While Carlos prepared the order, Jack recalled his conversation with Rebecca that morning. She'd been unusually affectionate, bringing him coffee in his office, speaking of future plans, as if trying to ease a guilt he wasn't supposed to know about. "Honey," she'd said, perching on the edge of his desk, "maybe we could take a trip this weekend. You've been working so hard lately." He'd looked into her green eyes, those same eyes he'd fallen in love with years ago, and seen only deception. Beautiful, skilled deception from a woman who had betrayed not just him, but herself. "Sorry, babe," he'd smiled. "Too much paperwork to catch up on, maybe next time." After she left, he'd retrieved the small box of C4 from its hiding place. His hands worked confidently, remembering skills he'd hoped never to use again. The explosive was pliable as clay, the detonator tiny, unnoticeable among the markings on the chemical container. "It's done, Mr. Thornton," Carlos's voice pulled him from his memories. Their truck just pulled up. Through the security cameras, Jack watched Mendez's men loading the supplies. Rebecca bustled around with paperwork, her hand repeatedly smoothing her hair, a nervous gesture he'd noticed whenever she was anxious. Had she sensed something, or was it simply the usual tension of her double life? When the truck departed, Jack activated the GPS tracking system. The red dot moved slowly across the town map, following the same route as previous deliveries. Everything proceeding as normal, they had no idea what they were transporting in their vehicle. "Mr. Thornton," Carlos fidgeted nervously with his shirt sleeve. "Are you sure no one will get hurt? There might be innocent people there." Jack shook his head. "At 3 in the morning at an illegal drug lab, there are no innocent people, son. Only those who have made their choices." They tracked the truck's entire journey to the factory, watched as the supplies were unloaded and brought inside. The GPS tracker showed the exact position of their package, placed in the central area where intelligence indicated the main production equipment was located. The waiting was hardest. Jack remembered this feeling from Iraq, when everything was in position, the plan in motion, and all that remained was to wait for the right moment. Carlos dozed in a chair, though his sleep was restless. He often twitched, murmuring in Spanish. At 3 in the morning, Jack retrieved the remote detonator, a simple black box with a single button, so unassuming, yet capable of changing everything. His finger hovered over the switch. "For your parents," he whispered, glancing at the sleeping Carlos. "For everyone they've hurt." The explosion on the security monitors appeared as a silent flash, but Jack knew at the sight it would have been deafening. The C4 had worked perfectly, catalyzing a chain reaction that transformed the lab into rubble. Distant sirens confirmed the operation's success. The morning news highlighted the explosion at the abandoned factory. Police discovered remnants of the lab, documents, evidence of the cartel's activities, but most importantly, no casualties. As Jack had calculated, the facility had been empty at that hour. Rebecca was unusually pale when she arrived at work, barely speaking, mechanically performing her duties. Then came the phone call. Jack observed through the cameras as she listened to someone on the line, her expression transforming from shock to fear. He knew who was calling, Mendez, and he knew the cartel leader wasn't one to simply accept defeat. "Mr. Thornton," Carlos appeared in the office doorway. "Their cars are driving around town. They're searching for something or someone. Jack nodded. He'd expected this. Mendez couldn't know for certain who had orchestrated the explosion, but he would have suspicions. Now the real game began, a game where their lives were the stakes. He checked the rifle in its cabinet, retrieved additional ammunition. War had come to his store, and he needed to be prepared. Only now, instead of a platoon of Marines at his back, he had a frightened teenager and a wife who had betrayed him. The surveillance cameras showed Mendez's men patrolling the streets around the store. They moved unhurriedly, predators studying their prey before the decisive strike. Jack recognized the hunting style. In Iraq, snipers had worked the same way, waiting, watching, choosing their moment. Tension hung in the air, thick and heavy as the Pennsylvania humidity outside. Everyone in the store felt it. Customers completed their purchases quickly and left. Carlos jumped at every sound, and Rebecca had become a shadow of herself. Jack understood the end game was approaching. Mendez wasn't a man who waited long. He would strike, and soon. The question was whether they were ready to meet that attack, whether he was prepared to defend what little he had left, his life, his store, and the boy who had become almost a son to him. Somewhere in town, a man with a scarred face was planning his revenge. And Jack knew it would be terrible, because men like Mendez don't forgive those who dare to challenge them. Chapter 4: Final Stand. The heat pressed down on Millbrook like a weighted blanket that morning. Shimmering waves rose from the asphalt, transforming Main Street into a rippling mirage. Jack watched the empty road through security cameras, his hand resting on the polished stock of his Remington. The rifle had accompanied him through Fallujah, Ramadi, and Kandahar. Everywhere death had breathed down his neck. Now he felt its breath again. He pulled an old photograph from his desk drawer, his Marine Corps graduation. Young, smiling faces, innocent of what awaited them. How many remained alive? How many, like him, had been forever changed by what they'd seen and done? Beside it lay his wedding photo with Rebecca. The same smile, the same happy eyes. How everything had changed. Carlos appeared in the doorway, moving with the silent grace he'd developed over the past months. The boy had transformed, stronger, more confident, though his eyes now held the same wariness they'd shown on that first rainy night. "Mr. Thornton, they're here." 3 SUVs just parked behind the hardware store on Oak Street. Jack nodded. He'd already spotted them on the monitors, black Escalades with tinted windows. Too clean for this dusty town, too expensive for ordinary customers. Cartel vehicles. "Where's Rebecca?" His voice remained steady despite the knot tightening in his gut. "In the showroom, arranging the new power tool display," Carlos replied, nervously fidgeting with his shirt hem, a habit that emerged only in moments of extreme stress. "She's been checking her phone constantly, and she was crying in the stockroom earlier. I saw her." Of course she was crying. Jack was certain she knew what was coming. Mendez had undoubtedly warned her. Perhaps he'd even promised to take her away afterward, once he'd dealt with her inconvenient husband. Or maybe she'd finally realized the magnitude of her mistakes, but too late to change course. The store's bell chimed, its cheerful tone incongruous with the moment's gravity. On the monitors, Jack watched 4 men enter, stocky figures in expensive button-ups too thick for the summer heat. Body armor, certainly. Their practiced movements as they spread throughout the store spoke of tactical training. These weren't ordinary thugs but professionals. Last to enter was Mendez himself. The scar that ran across his face, once an ugly disfigurement, now seemed almost elegant against his tailored suit. He moved with the relaxed confidence of someone accustomed to owning every room he entered, a man for whom human life held no particular value. "Mrs. Thornton," Mendez's smooth voice carried through the empty store. "What a charming establishment. I now understand why you're so attached to it. Though I must admit I imagined something more ambitious for a woman of your talents." Rebecca stood frozen by the counter, clutching a clipboard. Jack could see her fingers trembling, her lower lip caught between her teeth. The same nervous gesture from when they'd first met, when she'd been shy about her feelings for him. Richard, I don't know what happened at the factory, but... Oh, my dear, Mendez smiled, and the expression sent a chill through Jack despite the summer heat. Of course you do. Just as you know your husband proved considerably less helpless than we assumed. Planning such an explosion from a wheelchair, that requires exceptional talent. He signaled to his men, who spread throughout the store like predators circling prey. One headed toward the stairs leading to Jack's office. Carlos, Jack whispered, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. In that moment, he felt more strongly than ever that this child had become the son he'd once hoped to have with Rebecca. You remember what we discussed? The boy nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Yes, sir, like when my parents were killed. I won't just hide this time. No, son, Jack squeezed his shoulder. You'll act like a man. Carlos nodded and silently slipped toward the service exit. Jack knew he had only minutes before they discovered him, but those minutes should be enough. Mr. Thornton, Mendez's voice hardened, losing its veneer of civility. I know you're up there. Let's talk like civilized men. After all, we have something in common, your lovely Rebecca. She spoke of you with such admiration, you know, especially when describing how heroically you saved your comrades in Fallujah. Jack had already positioned himself near the office door. The Remington settled naturally against his shoulder. After all these years, his body remembered every movement. He felt transported back to Iraq, except now his enemy wasn't a faceless insurgent but a man who had stolen everything. His wife's love, his trust, his hope for normalcy. You know what's curious? Mendez continued, packing between display shelves as if he owned the place. I'm actually grateful for your little demonstration. That explosion, it eliminated certain, inconvenient partners. Now the entire operation falls to me. Of course, I'll need to start fresh, but, he laughed, I now have an excellent assistant. The sound of a weapon being cocked interrupted his monologue. One of the men had reached the top of the stairs and was aiming at the office door. Jack could hear his breathing, heavy, irregular. Amateur. The kind who shoots first but rarely hits the target. Come out, Mr. Thornton, Mendez's voice took on a steely edge. Or I'll be forced to disappoint your wife. Though, she's not really yours anymore, is she? Jack heard Rebecca's frightened cry as someone grabbed her. The security camera showed one of the thugs twisting her arms behind her back, pressing a pistol to her temple. There was no choice left. He slowly wheeled out of the office, the rifle resting across his lap. And here's our hero, Mendez spread his arms theatrically. The Marine who thought he could play my game. You know, Mr. Thornton, I did some research on you. Impressive record, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 3 in Iraq, Purple Heart for Fallujah, a genuine American hero, he spat the word. But here's the problem, heroes don't exist anymore. There are only those who know how to make money and those who get in their way. Jack silently studied the scarred man. Up close, he seemed even more terrifying, not because of the scar but because of his eyes. Dead, empty eyes of a man to whom human life meant nothing. Jack had seen such eyes in Iraq, in men who killed children and justified it with grand causes. Drop the weapon, Mendez nodded toward the Remington. Or your beautiful wife will join that Mexican kid's parents. Speaking of which, where is he? Hiding again like the coward he is. Rebecca whimpered as the thug pressed the gun harder against her temple. Her eyes met Jack's, filled with fear and remorse. For a moment, he glimpsed the woman he'd fallen in love with a year ago. The woman who had laughed at his jokes and hadn't been afraid of his disability. Time seemed to stand still. Jack looked at the woman he loved who had betrayed him but whom he still couldn't abandon. Traitor or not, she was his wife. He'd sworn to protect her. Till death do us part. Isn't that what they say in church? The Remington made a dull thud as it hit the floor, the sound deafening in the tense silence of the store. There we go, Mendez smiled his serpentine smile. "See, Rebecca, I told you all men are the same. Give them a chance to save a damsel in distress and they lose their heads, even if the damsel doesn't deserve saving." He pulled out a pistol, a beautiful chrome-plated Colt with a pearl handle. Such weapons weren't made for war, they were made for executions. "You know, I almost respect you," he said, aiming at Jack. "You turned out to be smarter than we thought, but you forgot the most important rule: never mess with those who have nothing to lose. I had nothing until I took it for myself. And you had everything and you lost it all." The roar of a forklift engine shattered the air before Mendez could pull the trigger. The yellow machine, driven by Carlos, burst from the service corridor like an enraged bull. In the cab, the boy looked so small, but his eyes burned with a father's fury, the same rage Jack had seen in his description of his father's final moments. Mendez only had time to turn. The forklift's steel forks had already pinned him against a paint display. The crack of breaking bones mingled with the crash of falling cans. White paint covered his expensive suit, transforming the cartel leader into a grotesque parody of a statue. Gunshots, screams, breaking glass, everything melded into a chaotic symphony. The men opened fire, but Carlos had already leaped from the forklift, taking cover behind an overturned counter. Rebecca broke free and ran for the exit, but stumbled over scattered tools. Jack acted on instinct, years of training taking over. The Remington was back in his hands, its familiar recoil pounding against his shoulder. One shot, the thug by the stairs fell, clutching his wounded shoulder. Another, the man who had held Rebecca grabbed his knee, his weapon skittering across the floor. Mendez lay pinned by the forklift, his legs unnaturally twisted, his spine clearly broken. Life's irony, now he too would never walk again. A harsh laugh, more like a sob, escaped his throat. "So this is how it ends. A boy and a cripple defeat the great Scarface." "No," Jack wheeled closer, keeping him in the rifle's sights. "This is how it ends for a man who thought he could take lives without consequences." The wail of police sirens approached. Someone in the neighborhood must have called 911 after hearing gunshots. The remaining thugs fled toward the exit, only to be met by arriving police cars. "Mr. Thornton," Carlos emerged from his hiding place. Blood trickled from a small cut on his cheek, but his eyes shone. "Are you okay?" Jack nodded, unable to speak. The adrenaline ebbed, leaving only exhaustion and a strange emptiness. He looked at Mendez, still writhing in pain at the destroyed store, at Carlos's frightened but resolute face. In that moment the boy resembled his father more than ever, the same direct gaze, the same unbending will. Rebecca sat against the wall, knees drawn to her chest. She wept silently, as people do when they've lost everything. Jack wanted to go to her, say something, but words failed him. What could you say to a woman who destroyed your life, but whom you still love? The first police car stopped outside, followed by a second, then a third. SWAT burst into the store, shouting commands. Jack slowly raised his hands, showing he wouldn't resist. From the corner of his eye, he saw them handcuffing Rebecca. She didn't try to run, just stood with lowered head. "I'm sorry," she whispered as they led her past Jack. I wanted something more, not this little life in this little town." "I know," he answered quietly. "I once wanted more too. Then I realized sometimes a small life with the right people is better than a big one with the wrong ones." Carlos stayed close to Jack as police led them through the cordon. He trembled from the ordeal, but his eyes held a strange mixture of fear and satisfaction. He had done what he couldn't do a year ago, protected his new family. "You were very brave," Jack said as paramedics seated them in an ambulance for examination. "Your parents would be proud of you." For the first time that day, the boy cried, not from fear or pain, but from relief. "You know, Mr. Thornton, when I saw him again, I thought I'd die from fear. But then I remembered what you told me. Courage isn't the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it." Jack pulled the boy close, holding him tight. He felt Carlos's heart pounding, his shoulders shaking. In that moment he fully understood it had all been worthwhile. All the loss, betrayal, and pain. It was the price he paid to save one young soul from becoming like Mendez. Detectives questioned them for hours. Sullivan provided all the necessary documentation proving the cartel's connection to the lab. Security footage, GPS data, bank transfers, everything formed a perfect case against Mendez and his organization. As the sun began to set, they were finally released. The store was sealed as a crime scene, but Jack no longer cared. He watched the setting sun painting the sky in fiery colors, thinking how strangely life works. Sometimes you need to lose everything to find something truly important. "Is it over now?" Carlos asked quietly, as if afraid to disturb the newfound peace. Jack looked at the boy he now saw as a son, at the ruined store that could be rebuilt, at the fatting day that had taken the ghosts of the past with it. "Yes, son," he answered. "One story has ended, but ours is just beginning."